So I think we'll kick off and let people continue to trickle in as and when. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you know, we're going to be discussing organised child sexual exploitation. This is a really important conversation, but it is a difficult one. So if at any point you want to take a break or leave the meeting, please feel totally free to do so, and we will all completely understand that. We're really lucky to have with us today an amazing panel. Sammy is a passionate campaigner, author, and a survivor. Nazir is the former chief prosecutor for the Northwest and was responsible for ensuring that large swathes of these abusers faced jail. And Maggie's a former detective who blew the whistle over police failings in Rochdale and now runs the Maggie Oliver Foundation supporting survivors. So we'll kick off with a little bit of context from me, and then we'll hear remarks from our panelists. Then we'll move on to a Q&A. I will lead the initial Q&A, but then there'll be an opportunity for audience members to put questions to our panel. So if you have a question, please just whack it in the chat function at any time, and I'll sort those at the end. So as you know, we're here today to discuss on-street child sexual exploitation. You'll all be familiar with the grooming gangs scandal exposed over the last decades, and this has led to real concern about CSE. These really high-profile grooming gang cases have absolutely shocked our country to the core, and what we all want to do is make sure the correct lessons are learned so that future children are protected. To protect other children, we have to confront the realities of these appalling crimes, and be alert to the fact that CSE can manifest in many different contexts with victims and perpetrators from all backgrounds. If we're expecting to see only a very specific model of CSE, all we're doing is creating blind spots for perpetrators. Speaking on the specific grooming gang scandal, we know that local agencies had been aware of grooming gangs in several northern towns for decades. In some cases, this knowledge was dating back to the 80s. But it wasn't until January 2011 that the government initiated an investigation into on-street grooming gangs, prompted by a long-running investigation in the Times. Now, what we learned was that across the board, agencies that were intended to protect children had failed to recognise, detect and prosecute the habitual rape of children. The horror of such crimes and these systemic failures were laid bare to the public in the J report. Now, it's worth revisiting here some of those key findings of the J report, because while it focused on abuse in Rotherham, the character of the crime it brought to prominence has appeared across the country. We think it's around 31 English settings. The J report estimated that at least 1,400 children had been abused in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. This included the rape of girls as young as 11 by large numbers of perpetrators. Many were raped by multiple attackers, trafficked to other towns and cities in the north of England, abducted, beaten and intimidated. The majority of those behind the abuse were British Pakistani, while the recorded victim survivors were typically young white girls. What's universally common in CSE is a targeted grooming or initiation process. Now that's designed to ensnare children into abusive exploitation, sexual or otherwise. This might kick off with the offer of something that the child needs or desires. It can be financial inducement, it can be purely attention. And though this process makes many children feel that they are in a genuine relationship with their abusers, we sometimes refer to this as the boyfriend model. What the perpetrator is doing here is intending to create a sense of obligation and loyalty in the child. Now, as I've mentioned, these cases are hideous and egregious, but they're not representative of CSE. There is no one type of victim survivor or one type of perpetrator when you're looking across the board. If we fall into that trap, we run the risk of failing to identify the Black and South Asian girls who were also abused by grooming gangs, boys first forced by gangs to run county lines while also being sexually abused, children with disabilities, and those who are not from working class backgrounds. We are all on this call united in horror at CSE, and we want to build a country in which every perpetrator responsible for these terrible abuses is identified and punished. So we can't restrict our thinking to just one tort orders offending. So with that, I'll hand over to our panelists who are kindly going to share a little bit of their professional background and offer some introductory remarks. Nazir, perhaps let's kick off with you.
I have now unmuted myself. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm not going to go down the usual route, which is talk about the cases that I've dealt with. I'm going to touch upon what Olivia just said a moment ago, really, about what differentiates this and perhaps some of the thinking or behind, well, there's no thinking, but some of the reasons and motivations behind this. We all know that it's underestimated. You mentioned 31 towns and cities. The Children's Commissioner back in 2013 said there wasn't anywhere in the country where abuse of children, particularly sexual exploitation, wasn't happening. So we underestimate the scale of it. We know that there's a professional's inability to recognize it, to respond to it. Some of it is driven by political correctness. Some of it is just dealt with by fear. More often than not, though, it's motivated by incompetence. They just don't know what to do, don't want to ask, and end up doing a really poor job. There's a failure of professional curiosity, not asking the right questions. There's a failure of putting the child to the center. Very often, as you're going to hear from Maggie and Sammy, the children themselves have got very chaotic, troubled backgrounds, and so you immediately ignore them because they're very difficult to deal with, rather than actually thinking, well, they have been abused and we need to respond to that. There's a failure of multi-agency working, so institutions often work in silos. They don't share information. There is little, if anything, done to disrupt perpetrators. They often feel that they can just do it with impunity because nobody really focuses on them and deals with whatever it is that they are up to, so to speak. And of course, victim blaming is at its center. We blame the victims for the choices they make, the lives they lead, rather than the perpetrator for doing what he ends up doing. And of course, the one thing they all have in common, regardless of ethnicity or country or age or place or whatever it may be, is that they're male. And that, I think, is something we need never lose sight of. And every time I hear we need to recommend more training, I always ask, well, what's wrong with the current training? We never ask that question. And we always go, unfortunately, authorities, institutions always go to the same usual suspects to deliver the training, often making a lot of money out of it, when in fact they should be going to the experts. And the experts often are, more often than not, are the victim-led organizations. And I think that's where we need to focus. You mentioned a moment ago about different types of models. Let me give you one example of a case. And this young girl was in a car park. She was 14, 15. She was gang raped by a group of men, and she's now in that car park late at midnight or something, and she's got hardly any clothes on her. She's covered in sperm. And who does she ring? Does she ring her carers? No. Does she ring the police? No. Does she ring any authority that might have any responsibility for her? No. She rings the person who first groomed her because he loves her. And yet he was the one that put her in the position that she was in. That's the strength of the grooming process. That's what why we have to intervene to affect that, to prevent it from taking control, so to speak. Olivia mentioned that there are victims from outside the British white community. Of course there are. The super complaint that the Halo project in Northeast have laid with HMIC is all about the poor performance in relation to Black and minority victims. The Muslim Women's Network report in 2013, probably forgotten by everybody, gave a picture of all these victims, and they face a bigger obstacle, namely the issue of honor and those kinds of issues, which mean that they won't come forward. So we know that there are victims everywhere, there are perpetrators everywhere, but at the moment, our focus entirely, sadly, is on somehow women should make a choice or women should do something different. Any strategy that begins with women must or women should is going to fail. It should be about what men must and what men should. And so I take the point that our attitude right now must be to succeed, must focus on the perpetrators, disrupting what they do, intervening, preventing future perpetrators, educating people out of the situation, and supporting victims. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Naz. Maggie, perhaps we'll move on to you.
Thanks, Olivia. Hello, everybody. Those of you who do know me will know that this is a subject very close to my heart that has really become the whole focus of my life. I first came across child sexual exploitation back in 2003 when I was asked to join Operation Augusta. Now, the cases that I'm known for are Operation Augusta and Operation Spam, both of which focused on Pakistani abusers, targeting very young, white, very vulnerable children in and around Manchester. What I saw was actually very much of a shock to me. I think I was probably very naive, and at that point I wasn't aware how far back this particular kind of crime stretched, where there had been very little activity, and basically the authorities turning a blind eye since the 1980s. It kind of took over my life, and I ended up resigning. Since that time, I've been very vocal about what I see as the failures, the deliberate failures of a system to protect the most vulnerable children in our society. You know, every single week, more or less now, we have another report and another review which says that, you know, there are inexcusable failures. We have another apology from another senior police officer, you know, commending the bravery of the victim and saying that lessons will be learned. But those lessons are not being learned, because we have case after case where we see a repeat of the same failures. You know, my journey led me to start my own charity, the Maggie Oliver Foundation. So when I'm speaking now, I'm not speaking about historical failures, horrendous as they are. Even more horrific, perhaps, is that what I'm dealing with today is current failures. We still have victim blaming. We have, in the past couple of months alone, 60% of the survivors of child sexual abuse or violence against women and girls who come to us for help have been themselves threatened with arrest. Many have actually been arrested. They are still being fobbed off, and the authorities seem to be unable to appreciate that victims are at the heart of this issue and must be listened to. In order for us to change things for future generations, we have to learn the lessons of the past. In my opinion, we need accountability for those senior public servants, senior police officers who are deliberately not taking a proper grip of what is going on. We need, as Nazir said, we need to be listening to victims and survivors and putting them at the absolute center of where we go with this problem. I mean, let's be honest, we are never going to stop child sexual abuse. We are never going to do away with it. What we do need to change, though, is the culture amongst the police forces, where there are actually some very good police forces, but we repeatedly hear from about the same forces that are failing so many victims that we have lost count. You know, the Greater Manchester Police is in special measures and has been for a good period of time now. HMIC went back just a few weeks ago to say that there still haven't been enough or any changes really in how they are listening to victims, how they are dealing with vulnerable people. We've had all the Sarah Everard stuff and the criticism of the Met. You only need to scratch the surface to see that sexual abuse and violence against women and girls is bottom of the pile. It is not prioritised. And I would like to see a major overhaul. I would like to see organisations like the Maggie Oliver Foundation brought in, as Nazir has just said, listening to those who know what they want, listen to the victims, listen to the survivors, work with organisations like ours who have no agenda, no ulterior motive other than to make the system better. But by not acknowledging the failures, by not facing up to what is wrong with the system, and funding it, resourcing it properly, and putting, sexual offences unit with duly experienced and trained officers at the heart of it, have perhaps expert witness in court to explain what a victim goes through, who has been abused, how it affects them, how they may present in court. Stop blaming victims, stop turning away from investment, from resourcing, from listening to where everything is going wrong. I think I will stop at that point, but I think we all have a duty to speak out, however difficult that is, however many people we may upset in that process. There's a very well-known quote, I can't remember who said it now, I've forgotten, but the saying is that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. And I think we are all good people, and it is our duty to do something, because unless we speak out, unless we highlight these failures, and unless we say that as a society, as a civilized country, we are not prepared to stand by and see another 30 or 40 years of cases where new generations of children are having their lives destroyed, I think we cannot call ourselves a civilized country. So I think for now, that's where I'll end.
Thank you so much, Maggie. Now, last but not least, Sammy.
Thank you, Olivia, and good afternoon, everybody. I just want to start just by telling you a little bit about who I am and where all this started for me. Now, I met Arshad Hussain just after my 14th birthday. I'm from Rotherham, and I grew up in Rotherham my whole life. I'm the youngest of 3 sisters, and as a child, I was very confident, I was very bubbly, had a lot of friends. I came from your normal everyday kind of family, and I suppose there was nothing vulnerable about me apart from the obvious, and that is I was just a child when I met him. Now, I met him just on my local shop, so I suppose I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or at least I wasn't, he was. And I'll never forget the first moment I saw him, and I was kind of instantly mesmerised by him. He was 24, and he didn't look like a paedophile, because I was always told what a paedophile was. It was some fat old man in a flat, masturbating, looking in the kids' playground, or someone that was going to pull up in a van, offer you some sweets, kidnap you, and never see you again. So for me, he didn't ring any alarm bells when I met him. But he was 10 years older. He was driving a sports car, very, dressed very well in designer clothes, spoke quite well. He was funny, charming, and he knew my friend a little bit, so he didn't feel like a complete stranger for me. And I knew his brother a little bit as well. And of course, as a child, if you know somebody or somebody, it kind of feels like you know him as well. So when he asked us if we wanted to go for a spin in the car, we thought we was just gonna, go and have a bit of fun. It was a bit cool to be with somebody a little bit older than you. And I had no idea, but that was going to be the moment that changed my life forever. And when I got in that car, I would go on to be abused mentally, physically, and sexually for several years. Now, the grooming process is what started first. And I always say that it's the most dangerous, and it's the most dangerous of crimes, because it's a silent crime and it happens to you without you even knowing it's happening. And also it can be very enjoyable. And I speak to many survivors that say that, but they say, Sam, I'll never say that to anyone else, because it feels like, I deserved what happened to me. And I think it's just so important that we be honest about what happens, because we can't tackle something if we can't be honest about it. But first of all, he came into my world and he found out everything there was to know about me, who I was, my family, my friends, what school I went to, what kind of things I liked, like music and movies and all that. And it turns out we had a lot in common, because he liked everything that I liked as well. And once he got all of that information, he took me into his world, which of course was very different. It was very dark, very violent. And once I was inside of that, it was very difficult to get out of. But I went missing for days, weeks and months at a time. There was one time when I was missing for over 2 months, and I was absolutely everywhere: houses, flats, B&Bs, even in his family home. I found out later on that he was married with children, so he was a family man as well. And I went on to become pregnant twice. So first time when I was 14, I had an abortion. And the second time I was 15 and gave birth when I was just 16 years old. And I was allowed to keep my second child. And the reason why that was is because the authorities said that he could have access to me as long as I met him at the top of the road and was back for 10 o'clock. Now, as I said earlier, I'm from a normal everyday kind of family, and I think that many people forget just how much this takes a toll on families as well. This isn't just about victims. And I was very, very fortunate to have the family that I had. They was really fighting for me. My dad would constantly report it to the police, and the police actually threatened my dad and said, if you continue this, we're going to arrest you. And my dad didn't care if he was arrested, because, in his mind, I'm his little girl. He's there to protect him, and he's going to do whatever he can to do that. My mum would cry herself to sleep every night, and my sister had to move out the family home, and our home wasn't a home anymore, you know, with laughter and love. It was like a war zone, screaming, shouting, and it was very, very clever what Arshad Hussain did. And he worked out the dynamics of my family, you know, who I was closest to. And he came in between those relationships, and what he did, not just with my family, but he did that with my friends as well, because he was abusing a lot of my friends. He kind of made it as it was really, really difficult for me to come forward and talk to somebody about what was going on. But I, for a very long time, didn't realise, you know, what was happening was wrong. You know, I thought this man was my boyfriend. I loved him. We was going to live happily ever after, get married, have kids. And of course, he was a paedophile, but he was also criminally exploiting me as well. And that's very clever for perpetrators to do, because I'm the one that will get in trouble with the law. And what that will also do is affect my future for the rest of my life. But of course, you don't think about that when you're a child. You kind of think in the moment. But also, it stops me from coming forward and reporting as well, because if I then come to the police and say, well, actually, you know, this is what's happening to me, and he's, you know, made me do this, well, it means I'm going to get arrested as well, and then I'm going to get criminalised. But that went on for about 2 years, and I eventually got out, and I tried many times to get out, and every time I did, he tried to kill me. And I remember once he dragged me into the car with my hair, and he said if he couldn't have me, no one could, and he was going to kill us both. And he went speeding at the top of the street, and he sped through 2 cars and into a church, and I was rushed into hospital. And I was actually pregnant at that point, so I thought I was having a miscarriage as well, but fortunately my son was safe. But there was another occasion when I tried to leave, and again in the car he started speeding towards the edge of what I describe a hilltop, and it's a really high hill that overlooks all of Rotherham. And right at the last minute, he slammed the brakes on, and I still to this day don't know how we didn't go over the edge. But I got out the car, I was physically sick, and he took me to the edge, and he said he was going to throw me off it. And I honestly thought at that moment, that's where my life was going to end. And I was so scared, I wet myself. And then he put me into the back of the car, and he had sex with me as though nothing had just happened at all. And I remember just laying there, and I was crying, but it was a silent cry. And all I, you know, the only way I can describe it to you was like I was just a dead body on a slab in a morgue. And that's how I started to feel all the time. And I had this feeling, you know, there constantly. And I knew it was because of him. I knew I had to get away from him. It was just so difficult because every time I did, and even when I did start to go to professionals, I remember saying to my foster carer, if he rings me, I don't want to speak to him. And she said, well, you know, you're going to get back with him, so you may as well. There was so many missed opportunities by professionals, and I was never looked at as a victim. I was always looked at as his girlfriend, his mistress, and somebody that was a part of his gang rather than somebody that was a victim to it. But I'm going to wrap things up a little bit because I could honestly sit here all day telling you, you know, things about what happened. But it took me a long time to, you know, really come to terms with things. And it was just very easy just to put it in a box, put it away, and pretend it just didn't happen. Because, you know, when we was talking to people, I made my first statement when I was 16 years old. Absolutely nothing happened whatsoever by police and other authorities. And I decided that I was going to talk to Andrew Norfolk, and I heard that Andrew Norfolk, he's a journalist for the Times newspaper, that he was covering stories like mine in Rochdale and in the country. And he'd actually been in Rotherham for some time before I spoke to him. He'd spoken to other people. And he'd actually been publishing stories about Rotherham before I spoke to him. And unfortunately, they all got ignored because services were too bothered with trying to protect their reputations than actually acknowledging that there's thousands of children that have been groomed, abused, raped, trafficked, and some even murdered. They didn't want to deal with that because, as I say, their reputation was far more important. And when I came forward to Andrew and I told him, you know, about what happened to me, I honestly thought I was going to be ignored. And it is one thing I'm very proud of in my life is just what my story achieved. And Andrew published my story in August 2013. And it opened up the criminal investigation. So I went on record to police and told them what happened. And that interview opened up every police investigation in South Yorkshire, which is now known as the National Crime Agency Investigation Operation Stovewood. But also it triggered the J report. And for me, what was frustrating is that the council actually admitted, I think it was at the select committee, that the only reason they commissioned that J report is because I named one of their professionals. There was a Labour member and deputy leader of Rotherham Council, and I also named Arshad Hussain. But, you know, to describe the last kind of nearly 10 years since exposing what happened in Rotherham, it's very difficult to put into words. It's been a little bit like a circus. And especially for my son as well, that's been really difficult. And one of my campaigns, and I've done many campaigns, is for more support to be done for children conceived through rape and exploitation. And, you know, for me to go to a service, I've got a label, so I'm a victim of exploitation. So I can walk into just about every service, and you know, they know kind of what I've been through. They've got professionals there, you know, in place to support me. Not one person really knew what to do with my son. You know, it kind of got to the point where we had every service in Rotherham, and the advice he was given was to go into prison to actually ask the rapist himself, which is his dad, and get his answers there. Which was absolutely shocking. And, you know, lots of people say to me, well, Sammy, you know, what happened to you was 20 years ago, and, you know, we're a lot more forward and we've got a lot more support now, and, you know, things are so much better. And I agree that things are a lot better now than what they was back then. But I can tell you right now, they are massive failings throughout this country with services, and not even just local services, but within government as well. And the reason why I still campaign is because we still as a country don't understand grooming, abuse and exploitation. You can't tackle something if you don't understand it. And there's not just one thing that can, you know, tackle it and help people. You know, for counselling, for example, they are victims waiting for years and years just to be able to get into therapy. They are people still being criminalised for being criminally exploited. There's so much that we need to do, and you know, as both Maggie and Nazir have said, it takes everyone to be able to do that. And I agree, I don't think that we're ever going to be able to stop exploitation, at least not in our lifetime, but that doesn't mean that we can't be determined enough to try to stop it, to at least prevent it, because the last thing I want is lots of little Sammys around, and unfortunately there's too many Sammys around. I'm going to stop there because, like I say, I could honestly sit and talk all day about what we need to do. But yeah, there is so much in like my campaigning. I've campaigned around licensing, counselling, criminal exploitation. And sorry, just to very quickly mention, I think that we're talking a lot more now about sexual exploitation, but I do really feel that criminal exploitation has really being left out of things, and we really need to start and have those conversations. If you look at what happened in Rotherham, you know, lots of stories came out about sexual exploitation, but to my knowledge, no one has yet been held to account for criminally exploiting us. But yet I've still got a criminal record, and I could have faced up to 102 years in prison. But yet Arshad Hussain has not been questioned about it. So thank you anyway for listening.
Thank you so much, Sammy. I think we'll all agree that was such a powerful contribution. And I know sharing your story isn't easy, so we're very, very grateful to you for doing so. I'm now going to be putting some questions to our panel. And as I say, we'll leave some time for audience member questions towards the end. So please feel free to populate the chat with those. Nazir, let's start with you. What were the obstacles to prosecuting these offenders? And do you think the law in this space is fit for purpose?
The law, the offences that we rely upon are, if it's sexual offences, 20 years old. If it's assaults, it's 140 years old. And lawyers, police officers are having to scour through legal books to try and find the right offence that fits whatever it is that is alleged to have happened. In the Rosedale case, the grooming gang case, we were the first in the country to try the internal trafficking offence, which was only created a few years prior to that, and successfully, as it happens. So people are trying their best to use whatever laws are available. I'm not entirely sure that we need more laws. I'm with Sammy on this. We need to look at what victims need now, rather than what more laws we need for perpetrators. In terms of obstacles, I think they've been very well highlighted. What Sammy had to say to you: a lack of professional curiosity. It's not my job. Somebody else needs to deal with this. Applying one model, i.e., they think victims must all look like this. They've all been in a nunnery all their lives. They immediately go to the police once they've been assaulted. They have this ridiculously outdated view of what a victim looks like. And even the assumption that they've come from chaotic backgrounds. A lot of the victims that I'm sure Maggie and Sammy know have got very loving family homes. It's that methodology that the groomer uses, which is so powerful, so controlling, that it can break through whatever environment that person lives in or is part of. I think the obstacles are, I think, resources are clearly an issue. We were making massive progress in the early part of the last decade, Olivia. We had specialist teams, specialist officers, specialists, this, that, and the other. We got a bit complacent. We reduced our resourcing. Those specialist teams either don't exist or they just exist in name only. There isn't any leadership. One of the things we did around 2013, you remember, the government made child sexual abuse a national strategic policing requirement. And that means that no police force in the country can underfund it. But they all find a way to divert monies from what should be spent on an issue. Because, as I think has been clearly highlighted, these are very difficult cases. Very often, the victim has trusted no adult ever. Why should she? Or he, for that matter. And so you've got to be prepared to think outside the box. And I think allow innovation. Very often we just usually have a straitjacket and do the same thing every single time. But actually you need a very bespoke approach to each person, Olivia, and I don't think that happens at all. So there's that. I think the other thing I suspect you're getting at is that people were worried about hostility from communities. Unnecessarily so. Let me make this abundantly clear. 99.99% of people from BAME communities absolutely detest these people. You're doing them no favors at all by not selecting and working to bring these people to justice. But for whatever reason, people felt, oh, it might raise community tension. Just absolute nonsense. It's just an excuse to not do anything. You can always blame somebody else for not doing anything. I never believe conspiracies. I believe it's just people are rubbish at their jobs and incompetent. And the more that they become self-aware of that and do some proper training, the point that all three of us have made, look at what you've got right now, and I can assure you it's probably not fit for purpose. And come to Maggie's foundation, come to Sammy, come to the organizations that are really doing excellent work, which is victim-focused, which understands the journey that a victim goes on, and you'll get a great deal more out of it.
Thank you so much. Maggie, in the wake of the hideous murder of Sarah Everard, Dame Louise Casey is conducting a review into misogyny in policing. You're a former police officer. Do you believe the police are institutionally misogynistic?
Go straight for the jugular, Olivia.
Absolutely.
Actually, I have to say that there are very antiquated attitudes within policing. And that isn't to say that there aren't many good police officers, but within the foundation, Olivia, we are increasingly finding victims who are being dismissed completely without even having a real conversation. And I think that is about attitudes and about victim blaming and about misogyny and about this particular kind of abuse being dismissed in many ways. So, we're looking at Sarah Everard, and the Met is looking supposedly at what went on. But what they, in my opinion, have done, that they they've tried to deflect the attention from the real issues within policing, which is throughout the country, and instead tried to focus on one individual who was rotten. You are never going to do away with those individuals, but what we need is a clean sweep. And in the same way that with the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, you know, there was a real determination to examine where the failures were. My experience with, particularly from my work within the Maggie Oliver Foundation, has been that the priority for every police force and every statutory service is to be defensive about their failures. And I agree fully with Sammy. You know, in order to learn the lessons of the past and change things for the future, you have to have an openness and an honesty and look at where those problems are, not try and deflect attention from them, because we won't change things. There's an attitude, or I'm always asked that, you know, I spoke out about what I saw 10 years ago. You know, there is many people will say, yeah, but things are all better now. This is historical and things have changed, but they haven't. I mean, I could, like Sammy, I could go on all day about some of the cases that we're dealing with in the foundation, but many of those victims who come to us because the authorities are trying to close them down. They are not listening to the victims. I mean, I can give you a case, but we're starting to try to build a relationship with police forces who want to work with us, with Operation Hydrant, which is meant to be the lead dealing with CSA and CSE throughout the country. And we are having some success at that. So just let me very briefly give you an example that will illustrate how damaging individual police officers can be on how victims are dealt with. We had one, and we don't really deal with children who are being abused. We deal with adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse or abuse. But we're increasingly being approached by parents and families who don't have anywhere else to go. And we had a case just a couple of weeks ago of a family who had found mountains of sexually explicit material on a phone, grooming, and where this child had been, she was 11 years old, encouraged to send eventually to 12 men in a gang pictures and messages. They were on the verge of meeting, and the granddad found the phone. They came to us, the dad came to us. We advised them to contact the police. Police officer went in eventually to see this family. And the first opening comments to that family was, you do know that your 11-year-old child has technically broken the law. They could be arrested. And immediately the whole family like shut down. The second thing that the police officer said, but I'm not going to do anything about it on this occasion, but I would advise you to delete everything off your phone. You know, we will say nothing more about it, and left. Well, fortunately, because they were in touch with us, we were able to intervene, connect them up. We made contact with the police force in question, also with Operation Hydrant. That has now been taken on board, but an individual victim shouldn't have to come to somebody like the foundation to be heard, to get justice, for the law to be dealt with these men. There's 12 abusers there. They're not just going to be abusing that one child. They are going to be abusing an army of children. And we need to be focusing on those perpetrators, on those abusers, and not blaming a child for being way out of their depth, controlled, coerced, frightened, threatened. That's an 11-year-old child. So we have to look at things in a different way. We have to stop blaming victims. We have to start to look outside the box. And when things like that happen, we need to be questioning the systems that are in place to allow that to happen. So where there is a will, there is a way. Where there is a will, there is a way, but we have to be creative in the way we deal with these. And without that, I don't think we are going to see the changes that we need for perhaps another generation.
Maggie, thank you so much. Sammy, I know you're very passionate about ensuring that exploited children aren't criminalised for offences they were forced to commit by their abusers. Could you tell us all a little bit about your Sammy's Law campaign and what you're trying to achieve there?
Yeah, of course. And do you know, I'm so glad, Maggie, that you've just used that story, because I get many people say, oh, the police wouldn't dare charge an exploited child now. This is something that happens in the past, and it's not at all.
Oh.
Sammy's Law is about ensuring that children aren't criminal and they are being exploited. And as I said earlier, it's a very, very good way for the perpetrator to keep the victim silent, because, you know, they could go to prison themselves. So what I'm asking for is that children aren't criminalised. Now, in the Modern Slavery Act, there is some offences that are protected. So, you know, be criminalised, but there's so many. Olivia, you'll probably know what the exact number is of all the offences that children still can be criminalised for. And what I'm also asking for is for people that have already been criminalised is to be given the opportunity to have that record cleared. Now, what's really, really important with this is we can't do just a blanket experience and just say, you know, wipe everybody's criminal records, because unfortunately, some people don't get out of committing crimes, and victims do go on to be dangerous people themselves. So we have to look at people as individuals and say, you know, for example, myself, okay, so, you know, what is Sammy doing now? Is she a risk to children? And, you know, kind of look at me as an individual and say, well, actually, no, she's not. So why is it that I've still got something on my criminal record from when I was 15 years old, and that will be on it for the rest of my life? Now, I just want to touch on as well, kind of the effect it has on us when we are criminalised. Now, first of all, you're told you're a criminal and that you've done something really, really bad. So mentally, you think, I'm a bad person, I've done bad things, and it really affects the way that you think. But also, jobs, I can't apply for certain jobs because, one, I'm considered as a dangerous person, and two, if I go into that job interview, I then got to sit there and disclose and go into detail with a complete stranger that I was actually raped and exploited. Now, you know, for me to talk about kind of what's happened to me, I've done it thousands and thousands of times, but I still feel, you know, quite uncomfortable when talking about it. So can you imagine how a victim feels when they've never told anyone, obviously apart from the police, that they've been exploited, and they've now got to sit there and speak to a complete stranger? It's wrong, it shouldn't happen. But also what many people don't talk about is, you know, for example, on my insurance, I have to declare that I'm a criminal. My premium goes higher. So not only am I being punished for being a criminal, I have to pay financially to be one. It's victim blaming. It's absolutely wrong. And, you know, these are children, and children as young as 9, 10, 11 years old, and they're being treated as the criminals. But yet, while the real criminals, you know, they don't get any punishment for it.
Sammy, thank you for that. That's really insightful. Nazir, we read an awful lot these days about these terrible outcomes for rape prosecutions, with less than 2% of police reported rape resulting in even a charge or a summons. What on earth is going on here?
Well, how long have you got? Well, I think we know things that work. Strange to say this, Olivia, but in 2015, 2016, we had the highest conviction rate for violence against women and girls, domestic abuse, and child sexual abuse in our history. So that's only 5 years ago. And 2012, we were pretty rubbish. So in 3-4 years, we turned it around. And now we've gone back to where we were even before 2010. And that comes down to we know what works. I said earlier on, specialist teams. Even if a force says they have a specialist team, it won't be the team they used to have. It'll be one officer coming in and out, doing something else, rather than what it used to be, which is, you know, a core cohort of people who are really passionate about this issue, who are really skilled and understand what needs to be done. So it's not properly resourced. You don't have the specialist teams. Same is true of prosecutors. You've also lost experience, Olivia. You know, if you think about it, we lost 21,000 police officers. We know that figure, but actually what we lost was those were the most experienced officers, Maggie level experience. So we actually lost 500,000 years of policing experience, and they will not be replaced by 20,000 officers outside a police academy for another decade or so. So in terms of experience, so we've lost experience, we lost specialisms. The NGOs that work in this field have had their funding slashed. They spend half their lives, Olivia, trying to raise funding. I'm a patron of 9 of them. I know how hard they work just to get some money to be able to do the jobs that they do. And so it's like a perfect storm. And then you've got the court system where, you know, particularly even pre-COVID, where you had 2 or 3 years to wait for a trial. It's now 3 or 4 years, you know? Why would you want to come forward knowing that it might be a 3-year investigation, 3 years before the trial, you know? So all of those things have happened at the same time, which has left us where we are. But given what I've just said, all of those things can be put right by simply looking at what worked.
Thank you very much. Maggie, based on your experience of working with survivors, I wonder what insights you can share on which children are really over-indexing as vulnerable to exploitation.
You know what, Olivia, I think that we are really seeing you would think that it was only children from very difficult backgrounds who were at risk. I don't think that's the case anymore. In the foundation, we are seeing more cases of children like the child I've just told you, spoken about, you know, from actually what you would consider to be a safe family. Because, you know, with technology and with the internet and vulnerabilities, no child is safe. So for me, one of the key things that we're trying to do at the foundation is educate, because I do believe that knowledge is power. So that's why really the drama 3 Girls that I worked on for 4 years is so important, in my opinion, because that, you know, whilst it is a drama, it does open up a conversation. And by having those conversations with your children, you can prepare them for some of the risks. But children in care are even more at risk than children living in a home with a family, because they don't, you know, one of the things that I'm always talking about is that children in care are not given any affection. You know, they just want a hug. And when I was a core participant on the ICSA inquiry last year, which I've been quite outspoken about, because they didn't, my main criticism was that they were looking at organised networks and they failed to include a single town or city from the north of England, which is predominantly where the organised networks are operating. You know, they didn't include Rotherham or Rochdale or, you know, Keighley or Telford. They picked areas that I would say were not really associated with organised networks. But one of the children who gave evidence there, an adult survivor, she was from a northern town, strangely enough, but she absolutely eloquently explained why she became vulnerable in the first place. She said that she'd tried to commit, for example, suicide 3 times when she was 12 years old. And when she came back and out of hospital, back into the children's home, she said, all I wanted was a hug. I just wanted somebody to cuddle me and care about me. And the only person that ever did that, or the only people who ever showed her any affection, were those who were actually exploiting and abusing her. The only time she got physical affection whilst living in a care home was when she was pinned down because she was in trouble. And I think that that is an issue that we really have to address. Children need love. They need affection. And if they are not getting it from other areas, they are extremely vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. So I think that that is one of the key factors that we have to look at.
Sammy, sentencing outcomes in this space are poor and inconsistent, and the full gamut of the law, including the Modern Slavery Act, aren't being used. This has been flagged by Andrew in our audience. So my question is, what does sentencing mean to survivors, and what changes would you like to see?
I think that we definitely need changes around sentencing. And for a victim or a survivor, if you are even lucky enough to get to the courtroom, you know, you've achieved something, because as we know, not many people do. And I honestly think the reason why we got the sentencing what we did is because our case was so high profile. And, you know, the police and everybody knew just how many people was watching. So they almost kind of threw every little bit, you know, of everything they could at our case. And I was very fortunate to get the sentence that I got. The man that raped me, he was sentenced to 35 years. And it's not very often you hear of that kind of sentence, you know, when it comes to exploitation. But even with that 35-year sentence, he only gets to serve half of that. And even when he's been found guilty after that trial, in other trials, he won't be added an extra time on. His sentencing will run current to it. And I think that's really wrong because, you know, people like me, we have to deal with this, and we're left for this to deal with for the rest of our lives. And, you know, not just me, there's family members that, you know, have got to live with this, and also my son. And, you know, even my son that weren't conceived through this to someone else, he's also had to deal with all this as well. So as a family, we are taking this on for the rest of his lives. And I think when you get such a high sentence like that, compared to if it was just 2 or 3 years, it's almost as if you kind of have this feeling of, I'm believed, and I'm, you know, I have people actually taking me serious and kind of, it's hard to describe, but kind of just saying, do you know what, I'm valued as a human being. You know, I know somebody who was exploited so badly, and even though, you know, she went to court and everything, her perpetrators got a high sentence because they exploited a lot of people. But when it came to her, there was only one charge. And I said, you know, how do you feel about it? And she said, you know, I'm absolutely gutted because they did, you know, the most horrific things to her. But she said, the fact that they're still in prison for such a long time, even though it wasn't for me, it was for other people, it gave her some peace of mind. So I do think that, you know, the sentencing and the way just even victims are treated when we go to court needs to change as well. And I'm going to say this just because our case was high profile and in the media. I think that the media need to do a lot of work on how they're describing us and the language that they're using. For example, 11-year-old was had sex with 100 men. No, she was raped by 100 men. You know, let's start and get things right. So I can't imagine going through that court case to get a verdict back saying not guilty. And I know that there's a lot of people that are to get that low sentence. So it's I consider myself quite fortunate.
Thank you, Sammy. Now, a great question from an audience member. What can we do to stop people becoming perpetrators? Nazir, I know you have a lot of views in this space. Perhaps you could take this one.
Yeah, well, I think it links into what you said earlier on about misogyny, not just in the police force, but in every side of community. We focus on women's safety to the detriment of male violence. That's where it's all about, and male entitlement. And, you know, as a man myself, I remember trying to organize a 1 Million Man March 5 years ago and getting 52 signups, you know, so we know that's the journey, that men need to start talking about this. I was really touched actually by a meeting I was at, in-person meeting I was at a couple of weeks ago, where there were 300 men in the room. First time, I think, ever talking about their own responsibility for this type of abuse. Certainly, first time I've been part of that conversation. And more of that needs to happen, Olivia. We can't keep saying, focusing on women and what women should do. That's the wrong approach. It's about what men should do. And of course, education is key to this. You know, too often, I'm afraid these perpetrators have never had any relationship education. They've never had any sex education. They learn it all from porn or from older groomers or whatever. And so the state needs to step in, and that's about having mandatory relationship education and sexuality education from a very, very early age in schools. So people can't opt out. They have to have that conversation. They need to learn from experts. They need to understand the impact. You know, just listen to Sammy and Maggie for 10 minutes. I can assure you, most perpetrators would go, I'm not going to go there. You know, it would be have a massive salutary effect on them. But we don't do any of that. We're literally playing at it, Olivia. You know, it's not seen as an integral part of curriculum. It's not seen as an integral part of our responsibility. And so men just carry on thinking they are entitled and they can do what they like. But you know, as I say, offending, you know, dealing with offenders is one thing. Preventing offenders coming up I'm afraid is not resourced anything like the level it needs to be.
Thank you.
Olivia,
Maggie, hello.
sorry, quickly add that.
Do.
I agree with Nazir. I think that it's really important that we get talking about this in schools, and I've done some talks in schools, and one of the first questions I ask the kids is who knows what CSE is, and you might get probably one or two people put the hand up. Then I say, okay, who knows what child sexual exploitation is? You might get about 5. When I say, okay, so what's child rape, do you know what that is? Then all the hands start going up. The kids are so uneducated about this kind of thing, and it's not just about going into schools and saying to girls, well, actually, if you do this and this, you're not going to become a victim. We should be saying to boys, well, actually, this is what you don't do to become a perpetrator. And I know that there's been a big debate of whether this should be in schools, and we look at kids and we want them to be kids, that sweet, that innocence. It's important that we teach kids in an age appropriate way. Let's not absolutely terrorize children, let's educate them. But lots of people say that well, actually, no, it's not down to schools, it's down to parents. And what we have to remember is that I think majority of abuse now actually happens within the family home. So if you've got, all this going into, at home happening, where are you going to go to somewhere that's safe? And where you can be educated properly? And of course, it's important as a school. And I find it that a lot of parents don't even know themselves what grooming and exploitation is. So why can we expect parents to teach it when they don't know anyway?
And Sammy, my next question was actually to you, and perhaps it's just expanding what you've just said. It was a question from Sylvia in the audience. What is the one thing you would like people to understand about CSA, CSE that they don't currently?
It can happen to anyone by anyone, because we still have this perception of what a victim is and what a perpetrator is. And one thing that the headlines did in Rotherham was kind of paint for everywhere that a rapist is a Pakistani Muslim. And don't get me wrong, the evidence shown that majority of the abuse was happening from Pakistanis and Muslims, but there was also a lot of white men committing abuse. There's black men, there's Chinese men, and not just men as well, but women. There was a lot of facilitators in my case. We don't talk about women, being perpetrators as well. So I just like everybody to know that don't ever think that this can't happen to your child, because it can.
Thank you. Maggie, a question from Roy in the audience. Based on your background as a police officer, what do you think the merits are for one single national agency responsible for educating, preventing, detecting and exposing CSE?
I think that the problem with that, Roy, is that if you get one person in that agency who actually is incompetent, the whole system below it will fall apart. And from my work, since before I resigned from the police, I spent 18 months banging on every single door trying to be heard. Nobody wanted to hear. And if even now throughout the country, there are many police forces. I think anecdotally, it's the smaller police forces who are better. The bigger the organisation, the more lost in that system the failures become. And so it really is hit and miss throughout the country as to where the success is and where the failures are. So I don't know, we've got Operation Hydrant and we're trying to work with them and individual police forces when we're approached by victims, but it really is often down to individuals. I'm involved now with beginning to train police officers who are coming into the force, new ones who have not yet been, destroyed or brainwashed by the system. I think that is where we're going to make the changes with the new people who come in. I was unusual in that I joined the police when I was 41. I already had very well developed sense of what was right, what was wrong. And for me, child protection and protecting children was the #1 priority for a police service to do. But I think unless you get those recruits early on, there is a culture within the police still that feels that seems to treat some of these children as though they don't deserve protecting. So I think the answer is to get in at the start, to bring people in like Sammy, like other survivors, to speak to police officers when they begin. I'm not quite sure that having one agency that's in control of everything is necessarily the right way forward.
Maggie, thank you so much. We're out of time, so I just wanted to thank you all so much for taking the time to be here today to join this really important conversation. I know that it's difficult, so we greatly appreciate your support. We actually, the four of us worked together on a report that we published earlier this year, which has, gosh, I think by the end we had 93 policy recommendations for how we could drive up our country's response to CSE. So do check that out. It's called Unsafe Children and it's on the CSJ's website. I also just want to thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you, and please, God, keep up the good work. We need you now more than ever. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time today.